Who was Eleanor of Provence, queen consort of Henry III? Not much is remembered of Henry's queen and her life before, during and after their marriage. This documentary aims to go behind the scenes of Eleanor's life to find out who was the queen to Henry III. Eleanor of Provence was born in the southern French city of Aix-en-Provence. No records exist of exactly when she was born, but it is generally believed to be around 1223. She was born into a Provençal noble family. Her father was Ramon Berenguer IV, Count of Provence, and her mother Beatrice of Savoy. Eleanor was one of 4 daughters born to Ramon Berenguer and Beatrice of Savoy, who prior to her and her elder sister's birth had 2 stillborn sons. All of Ramon's and Beatrice's daughters would go on to marry kings in Europe, raising the prominence of the family. Eleanor's older sister, Margaret, would marry the King of France, whilst both her younger sisters, Sanchia and Beatrice, would marry the King of Germany and King of Sicily respectively. Little is known of Eleanor's childhood except that she was well educated by her tutor, Romy de Villeneuve. Her education seemed to have included a strong desire to read and write, as she greatly enjoyed writing poetry. Eleanor's mother came from a powerful dynasty in modern-day Switzerland, and held a lot of influence politically at the time. Eleanor's uncle, William of Savoy, would be influential in matching her eldest sister, Margaret, in her marriage to Louis IX of France in 1234. Following this, William would use his influence to find a match for Eleanor. Eleanor would make a good match, as her intelligence and beauty was widely reported throughout Europe. He would start to negotiate with Henry III of England that Eleanor would make him a good match in marriage. Henry III was desperate for money at the time after paying 30,000 marks for the marriage of his sister, Isabella of England, to the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. Henry initially demanded a dowry of 20,000 marks for the marriage, but Eleanor's father shrewdly negotiated out of paying the dowry with the promise of paying 10,000 marks to his daughter when he passed away. On Tuesday 22 June 1235, Eleanor was formally betrothed to Henry III of England, and at the age of 12 would travel to England for her wedding into the English royal family. In modern times, a marriage at the age of 12 would shock us, but in medieval times they were a common occurrence. Canonical law also allowed sexual consummation of a marriage at 12 at this period of history. At the time of their marriage, Henry III would have been around 29 years old, 16 years her senior. Eleanor, who had never met let alone have seen Henry III, would meet him for the first time at their wedding on Monday 14 January 1236. They would be married by the Archbishop of Canterbury Edmund Rich, at Canterbury Cathedral. Eleanor would wear a golden dress with sleeves of ermine. The following day she and her new husband would travel to London. Here, she would be crowned queen consort to Henry, at her coronation at Westminster Abbey. Although her love for Henry would grow day by day, her presence would start to stir political friction in the running of the country. As a member of the powerful European family, the House of Savoy, Eleanor would bring a large number of her own courtiers, known as Savoyards, to her court. Gradually through their marriage, the Savoyards' influence over Henry III would grow, in particular her powerful uncle who arranged her marriage, William of Savoy. William would become very close to Henry, which in turn caused the barons, at the king's court, to become very unhappy. At the age of around 16 to 17, 4 years into their marriage, Eleanor would give birth to her first child with Henry. She would have a son, born in 1239 at the Palace of Westminster. This son would go on to be Edward I, also known as Hammer of the Scots, and Edward Longshanks because of his great height. Despite some differences the couple would have at court, they would still have a loving relationship, and Eleanor would go on to another 4 children together. In the year following the birth of Edward, Eleanor would give birth to a daughter called Margaret on 29 September 1240. It would then be another 2 years before Eleanor and Henry III would have another child together. When Eleanor only around 19 years old, she would bear Henry with another daughter, Beatrice, on 25 June 1242, who would be named after Eleanor's mother. A further 3 years would pass for the royal couple before their 4th and last son was born on the 16th January 1245. Eleanor would give birth to Edmund, who would become known as Edmund Crouchback, 1st Earl of Lancaster, Leicester and Derby. All of Eleanor's and Henry's children would be brought up in a family environment at Windsor Castle, with Henry making enough time to be available with his children as possible. In 1251, Eleanor's eldest daughter, Margaret, married Alexander III of Scotland. At the time of the marriage, Margaret was 11 years old and Alexander was only 10 years old. At this time though, Alexander had already been the monarch for 2 years from the age 8, when his father Alexander II passed away in 1249. As part of Margaret's dowry in the marriage, Henry III would demand homage from Alexander for the Scottish kingdom, which Alexander refused to comply with. In 1253, in response to a report that Castile was about to attack Gascony, Henry III would leave England. He would lead an English army to support Gascony against any incursion from Castile. For the duration of his absence from the country, Eleanor would act as both regent and Lord Chancellor for England. During her period as regent, Eleanor would be pregnant with her and Henry's last child. They would have a daughter, Catherine, born on the 25th of November 1253. Catherine though would soon fall ill with a disease which at the time could not be diagnosed, but modern historians suspect it could be something akin to Rett syndrome. Eleanor's husband campaign in Gascony would come to an end in 1254. Henry III would arrange with Alfonso X of Castile, a marriage between his son, Edward, who was 15 years old at the time, and Alfonso's half-sister, Eleanor of Castile. As part of this agreement, Alfonso would give up any claims on Gascony. In the same year, Eleanor's youngest daughter would marry John II of Brittany. Beatrice had many suitors for marriage prior to her wedding to John, including the kings of France and Norway. The tide of popularity would turn against Eleanor in 1263, when the citizens of London would turn against her. Eleanor, who had never liked Londoners, had demanded to be paid all outstanding debts due to her for her Queen Gold. Queen's Gold, which was a form of monetary tribute, where any fines handed to the citizens of the capital, 1/10 would have to be paid to the Queen. On 13 July 1263, the Londoners would attack her whilst she was travelling down the Thames by boat with whatever they could find, from food to stone paving and mud. If it was not for the intervention of Thomas Fitzthomas, the Mayor of London, she may have suffered serious injury of gold, even had been killed. In 1264 the Second Barons' War would break out in England. The Barons' Revolt would be led by the king's nemesis, Simon de Montfort. England would become too dangerous for Eleanor and she would leave the country into exile and form a royalist court from the safety of France. Whilst in her exile, Eleanor would spend her time raising French forces to support her husband against the rebels. But tragedy would strike to the royalists when the fleet carrying French forces to England to support Henry III would be sunk in a storm before it could leave Sluice in Flanders. Further disaster would hit the royalist cause in England, when both Eleanor's husband and her eldest son Edward would be captured by Simon de Montfort. At the Battle of Lewes, in East Sussex on the Wednesday 14 May 1264. With Henry a prisoner, he was forced to sign the Mise of Lewes, which effectively gave Simon de Montfort the position of overall power of the kingdom. Montfort would also keep Edward as prisoner under close surveillance to ensure the royalist would keep to the agreement. Edward though would escape from de Montfort's imprisonment at Hereford. Edward would then go on to slay Simon de Montfort and defeat his army at the Battle of Evesham on the Tuesday the 4th of August 1265. Following the Battle of Evesham in 1266, Edward and Henry would go on to defeat de Montfort's son, Simon de Montfort the Younger, at the siege of Kenilworth Castle, and bring about the end of the Second Barons' War as the last of the rebels would surrender. After the Battle of Evesham, with the Barons' War safely in the control of the Royalists, Eleanor would return to France. With the Baron War now past, Eleanor would see the birth of her grandson, Henry, son of her son, Prince Edward, on the Sunday the 6th of May 1268. Henry would naturally become second in line to the throne. In 1269, Eleanor's youngest son, Edmund, who had taken residence at Kenilworth Castle following the Barons' War, would marry in 1269 Aveline de Forts, who came from a noble family in the north of England. Following the marriage of Eleanor's youngest son, she would then be hit with a series of tragedies, starting with the death of her husband, Henry III, on Wednesday the 16th of November 1272 following a stroke. By his death, he would have reigned for 56 years. A record that would hold until the death of George III around 550 years later in 1820. After the death of her husband, Eleanor would spend most of her time raising her grandson Henry, until Henry grew sick and would pass away from natural causes on Saturday 14th October 1274. Henry's death would hit Eleanor hard, and she would go into mourning and demand that Henry's heart would be buried at Guildford Cathedral. Following the death of her husband and her grandson, her youngest son's wife, Aveline, at the age of 15 years old on Saturday 12 November 1274. It has been widely believed that she died from childbirth, which was very dangerous at this time. A few years later, her eldest daughter, Margaret, Queen of Scots, would pass away on Tuesday the 26th of February 1275 at the age of 34 at Cooper Castle in Fife, Scotland. Then a month later, Eleanor's other daughter, Beatrice, would die on Sunday the 24th of March 1275. Happier news would bless Eleanor's life later that year, when her youngest son, Edmund, would marry again to Blanche of Artois, who was a Queen of Navarre until the death of her husband 2 years previously. Eleanor, though, would be relieved to see an heir born to the throne again, when on Tuesday 12 April 1284, when Eleanor of Castile would give birth to Prince Edward, latterly, Edward II. To give her son, Edward I, the much-needed male heir, would give birth to Prince Edward, latterly, Edward II. With the Plantagenet kingdom secure, Eleanor would head into retirement at Amesbury Priory in 1286 at the age of around 63, which was considered a very great age at the time. Here she would join two of her granddaughters who were already nuns at the priory. Mary of Woodstock, a daughter of her eldest son, Edward, and Eleanor of Brittany, a daughter of her youngest daughter, Beatrice. Eleanor would pass away, most likely from natural causes, between the 24th and 25th June 1291 at the age of about 68. Although she was buried in Amesbury Priory, the exact position of her grave was never recorded by the nuns there, thus making her the only Queen of England to be buried without a marked grave, although her heart was taken to be buried at a Franciscan priory of Greyfriars.